We are going to move to our next session where we have Peter Harrison. Peter studied industrial design at the Technikon Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He has worked as a product designer and consultant for more than 25 years. Peter was instrumental in starting the three-dimensional design program at the Open Window Institute before moving to Inscape Education Group, where he now serves as the Postgraduate Academic Manager. He remains convinced that well-conceived, appropriately designed products have the potential to uplift people's livelihoods through creating employment opportunities. And here at WDO, we'd have to agree. Peter, please, the stage is yours.
Natalie, thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen with you. Good. Now Perfect. I can see you as well.
Yes, thank you, Peter.
Sorry. Technology. Thanks for your patience. Okay. Well, good morning and welcome, and thank you to the previous speakers. It was fascinating to just hear some of what you were saying. And I think what we're doing in South Africa is so aligned with a lot of the thinking that's going on all over the world around design at present. My presentation is really about leading positive change via participatory industrial design and education. And as some of you might well be aware, positive change in South Africa is something that relates to a society that is still in many ways. A lot of positive things have happened since 1994 with the release of Nelson Mandela, but there's still a lot that needs to be done, and we still find ourselves living in a very polarized society in South Africa. And I have personally experienced how participatory industrial design is an incredible window into the lives of people that you might never ever have come across or ever interacted with. But more so than that, it's also not only does it become relational in terms of the participants that you're dealing with, but it's also educational in that the designer is learning from the participants, and the participants, who I will term non-designers, are learning about design, and that gets really exciting. So I chose this slide just to sort of situate us globally. This is an interesting view of our planet from the South Pole, and this is the tip of Cape Town, just there where my cursor is, and Pretoria would be roughly here, and that's where I'm speaking to you from today. So our view of the world is very different in so many ways. The case study that I was involved with took place in Soweto, which is very close to Johannesburg, and that's in Gauteng province. These are the cooling towers in Soweto, and they were decorated some years back with some beautiful murals. So if you ever get to visit Soweto, Johannesburg, you're able to bungee jump off of these, and I recommend it. It's great fun. So Johannesburg is here, and this just gives you an idea of Soweto in relation to Johannesburg. This outlines the border of Soweto, and the bulk of this case study took place in this area, Naledi and just south of Dobsonville. And it was done amongst a group of about 30 participants. There were 6 key informant farmers that I was able to continually go back to and meet with, just to keep some sort of continuity throughout the study. And of course, I don't speak isiZulu or Xhosa, so I had to do a lot of the work through an interpreter. And when I'd started the study, I initially had no idea how industrial design might support urban farming. So what I had to do was spend a great deal of time at the outset visiting farmers, attending their meetings, going along to events. And there were 3 particular sort of groups I worked with. I was working with Izindaba Zakudla, which is a research group attached to the University of Johannesburg. Izindaba Zakudla in the isiZulu means conversations about food. And really what their thrust is dealing with this issue of food insecurity. And in South Africa, we have about 25% of our poor are facing food insecurity. And that's that can be a meaningless term, but what that actually means is that anywhere from that people anywhere from sort of between 3 to 10 times per month are going without food. So that just sort of illustrates the problem of food insecurity. And I think we've now realized we've kind of passed this tipping point that we need to move beyond being only consumers to being prosumers, where we are both producers and consumers. And it's very interesting because I think the urban farmers have realized this sort of ahead of the curve, and they've been doing this for quite some time. So as I was visiting the farmers and working through Izindaba Zakudla, I also came across another group called Food and Trees for Africa, and I would attend their events. And then I would also work within the Region D Farmers Forum. So Soweto is broken up into various regions, and I was working with a group of I had access to about 300 farmers, but I was specifically working with this group of 30. They were both male and female, and funnily enough, there weren't many young farmers. Farming doesn't have a very sort of a positive connotation for the youth in South Africa. Many of the youth have kind of moved away from farming, and they'd far rather work, in sort of white collar jobs. But the older generations are still very attached to the land, and they understand the land, they understand farming. And a lot of the, culturally are deeply rooted in farming. And as I explored the areas, I found one common denominator was that the soil was often very, very poor. Many of the allotments are amongst houses. You can see in this picture here. So farmers are often farming on ground, which is if you were given a choice, you could view that soil as being really poor soil, and normally you might not choose to farm there. But these farmers don't have a choice. They don't own the land. They often farm allotments that are attached to primary schools, and this is where this meeting was taking place, was just behind the primary school at Kladi. What I noticed in the early exploration was that the farmers that were composting and mulching, they were having a lot of success, and the image on the right shows you that. These are some other farms that I was visiting. Again, some farms are more sort of advanced. They've actually got irrigation running. Here we see in the bottom right an illustration of compost heaps. So farmers are well aware of the fact that they need to build the quality of their soils, and they need to improve the moisture content in soils. This group of farmers had an interesting strategy. They would stop the trucks belonging to the city of Johannesburg and persuade them, for lack of a better word, perhaps give them some cool drink or some sweets or something, to drop off the shredded material that the city of Johannesburg had used with their chippers on the allotments, because they realized this was fantastic mulching material. The reason mulching is important in our climate is that it is, typically really hot and dry. So the sun bakes down on the soil and very quickly dries it out. And that's why the whole idea of mulching and composting being so beneficial was an important idea to support. Prof. Anna Moroni at the University of Politecnico di Milano talks about creative communities, and I certainly found that with this group, the Region D Farmers Forum, this was a fantastic example of exactly that. This is a creative community who have realized that they can't wait on government, and they've realized that they need to start doing something about the soil quality in order to improve their yields and to bolster what farmers call sustainable intensification on small areas of land. So I quickly learned that soil infertility was an issue. I learned that the farmers understand soil maintenance. I learned that organic matter is available, but remains uncomposted in dry climates. And a big part of this learning was just through many, many conversations with farmers and getting to know them and building relationship and building trust. And as you can imagine, I was very much the odd one out in Sowetan society. Thankfully, I had an interpreter who was great at introducing me. But it was really through attending events and meetings that I was able to build a level of trust and sort of a rapport with the people that I was working with. For those interested in the theoretical side, I just want to frame this quickly in participatory design. And what's interesting, what I found is that not only is this push-pull tension between users moving towards researchers or the move of researchers towards designers, and this other tension between what is in the design orientation and what could be, in other words, futuring. And I think it was Brandon was talking about how designers have this ability to envision futures. I think our designers also, we tend to be idealistic, and we need to be positive, and we need to maintain that. But not only were these tensions here, there was another tension that I found, and this was really interesting. And this is the tension in the designer themselves. So you're undertaking a participatory design project. You are wanting to hear your participants, but at the same time, you are leading the project and you are having to make design decisions. And you're switching between having to be democratic and really hear your participants and allow them space in which to voice their opinions and their ideas, and to nurture those ideas and to nurture their creative enthusiasm. So you need to allow that space, because that's also, very closely linked to the relational component that you are building and the rapport that you are building with your participants. But at the same time, there's a point in that process where you need to be what I would term autocratic, for lack of a better word, and actually make a design decision. So occasionally farmers would suggest quite outlandish ideas. For example, early on, I was convinced that pedal power was the way to go. I'd done a lot of research around hand operated versus pedal powered operations, and you can get far more power out of pedaling than you can out of hand operations. I'd had to move away from diesel and petrol and electricity because any of those would be inaccessible to farmers. They cannot afford those additional costs. So human power became the natural route to follow. But in developing the pedal-powered approach, farmers would suggest things like a bubble canopy to keep the rain off one if you were using it in a rainstorm. Now, as exciting as that idea was, I knew that from an appropriate technology point of view and a cost point of view, that an idea like that wouldn't really be viable, and it would actually just kill the project, so to speak. So that's an example of having to hear your participants and sit on it, mull on the idea, possibly contemplate what else could we do to keep people dry. But ultimately, in that specific instance, using an expensive material like polycarbonate just wasn't an option. I also learned that, people who are outside of design or non-designers, people who haven't been educated as designers, say, struggle to envision. And we sort of just take it for granted that, people can envision things, and not everybody can. So it was, I quickly found those in the group amongst my key informants who were good at envisioning, and that was incredibly useful to sort of plug into that skill amongst my participant farmers. I also found that farmers didn't understand the sort of typical industrial design, technical drawings, engineering drawings, renderings weren't that useful in semi-structured focus groups and interviews. And what worked far better was creating little models. So I would often just CNC or laser cut bits and pieces or components out of masonite or chipboard, just to have something in hand that farmers could sort of, look at and play with. And it was in the looking and the playing and fiddling with that and my observation of what they were doing and how they were doing it, that I was able to advance, some of the design decision making. So this knowing when to finalize decisions, just coming back to that, you're in this democratic participatory process, but there is a point where, as the leader, the design lead, you are having to make that call. Here we were checking pedal power and making decisions around that. And I was convinced this was the way to go, until I realized that none of my female farmers rode bicycles, nor were they prepared to use a pedal powered shredder. It was not something that they would do. So you really have to continually refer back to your participants, liaise with them, communicate, and work accordingly. Here's an example of just a rendering, and you can imagine you show that to a farmer and they might say, that's great. But what you really need to do is prototype it, because I learned so much more from watching people interact with working prototypes. And I developed a very simple strategy. I had orange stickers and green stickers, and it was either a like or a dislike. So farmers could interact with the prototype, and we were able to push some organic debris through it and chop it up, and they could then critique the prototype for themselves. Another challenge was a lot of the farmers were very polite. So I often felt that they weren't being brutally honest with me about my prototype or about the product. And what you actually want when you're doing a participative project is you really want brutal honesty, because someone telling you that it's great when you have a strong gut feel that it's not, isn't that useful. So I learned to sort of discern, who was just being overly polite, and then try and seek out those who were brutally honest and really weren't sparing my feelings, because I learned more from them, really. So the first stage of the project results in this pedal-powered shredder that I then find has no appeal to my female farmers, and there actually are more female farmers in the Soweto region than there are male farmers. So this was hugely problematic. And of course, I had to go back to the drawing board. So that meant a lot of design changes, a lot more simplification, reducing costs, stripping out complexity. The other thing is I found the cost of the pedal power was sort of around 10,000 Rand, and that was going to be totally inaccessible for a farming community. Even if they were to share it, it would still be too expensive. So we then embarked on a different tangent, and I started to look at how I could cut out cost. I was also consulting with participant mechanical engineers, engineering professionals, and they were saying, you need high tensile steel and you need high tolerances, but all of that was at odds with my theory, which I'd adopted, which was appropriate technology from Schumacher, where it needs to be bare bones and it needs to be cost effective. So whilst I had to also, sort of put some of the farmers' ideas on ice, move away from those to more practical things that I knew as a designer would work, I also had to do that with, some of the counsel I was getting from professional engineers, because I figured out that what we actually needed to do was we could spend some cost on the critical areas around cutters and shafts and laser cut components, And then we could build frames out of whatever material was on hand. And there are many artisans in Soweto who weld up security gates and burglar bars and that type of thing. So they have the equipment and they have access to steel. So that was another hugely important component for me was that the local community would be able not only to use the product, but to produce the product and maintain the product going forward. That all spoke to the viability, the long-term viability, and adoption of the product. So through the participatory design process, I learned that farmers needed custom equipment. Many of them who were trying to make mulch were using hand tools, and it simply just takes them too long. And as a result, they don't get to make enough mulch fast enough. On the right-hand side, you can see the results of chopping up just sticks and debris. And that allows, not only for shorter composting cycles, more frequent composting, but as I've mentioned, it builds the soil quality, and that indirectly then increases their yields. And that ultimately the goal is to build more resilient farming communities. And this is really the positive change that I'm referring to in my talk. And this awareness that as an industrial designer, the decisions you're making during the design and development, they have long-term ramifications. And we as students are always taught to design the problems out. And it's so important to be making the right decisions during the design development stage, because, otherwise we now live on a planet where we are surrounded by so many glaring examples of when this hasn't been the case, and we really are wanting to move away from that. I'm very happy to say that at Inscape we are really on a drive to inform our students about sustainable design, about the circular economy. We've recently partnered with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation about who've been working on this for some time, and we're thrilled about that. So, we really are wanting to promote this type of thinking amongst all our students, and send them out into the world with a greater awareness of our society and a greater awareness of needing to do good as designers. So ultimately, through the use of the human-centered design approach and a lot of engagement with my participant farmers and the lens of an appropriate technology design criteria, we came up with this brief. It needed to be hand-powered, cheap to maintain and run, mechanically accessible, locally produced, easily repaired, and fit for purpose, and safe to use. So many of the farmers have families of their own, and there are children running around. So it was a key aspect of this project that I needed to sort of almost disable the shredder, because it's the type of thing that could definitely harm hands or little hands if children were nearby. So the solution to that was to make I basically split the cutters from the surfaces that they cut against. So what you could do is you just remove the hopper, and that made the unit safe. So that was how we dealt with that issue. Here you see a version of the shredder just standing on angle iron framework. Very, very cheap, very accessible material. And in this instance, the wheels of that wheelbarrow had long ago been taken for other purposes, perhaps used for a go-kart or something. But here the farmers have just got what's left of that wheelbarrow, and they're using it. But the idea behind elevating the shredder here was either to hang a sack underneath it to collect the compost and then redistribute it, or you could wheel a wheelbarrow in underneath and then redistribute it. The other thing is, because the farmers don't own the land, the shredder had to be portable. So they had to be able to pick it up. So it didn't weigh more than 20 kilograms was my cutoff, because I knew that there was a good chance they would need to be able to move this. So some of the four kind of factors that I arrived at through the study was that it needed to be absorptive. In South Africa, we want to create jobs. not take jobs away from people. And that's why designing something sort of with a first world mindset, with a diesel engine or something, actually in this instance wasn't the right approach. If I could have people gathering material, using the shredder, and then distributing material, that was actually ideal. So the project was envisioned with having sort of a minimum of 3 to 4 users. And also then taking turns actually powering the shredder. That was the other aspect of that consideration. The technology had to be affordable. I wanted something really robust and, created this rectangular steel frame. Farmers took one look at this and they said, A, that's expensive, and B, it's going to fill with rainwater and that's going to rust. And as the product designer, I thought, actually, that's very good advice. So we moved away from that and went to this angle iron framework. How am I doing for time, Natalie? I can't see a timer here.
Peter, it is actually exactly 6 o'clock. We can leave you another minute or two to finish your presentation, and then we'll move on to our next speaker.
Thank you. Yes, so it had to be accessible and appropriately engineered and cost effective. And thank you so much. I just wanted to acknowledge my two supervisors, Dr. Angus Donald Campbell and Dr. Nordia Milan. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you all.
Thank you, Peter, and sorry that we didn't have time to answer any questions today. Do continue to engage with our speakers in the chat if you are using Hopin, Facebook, or YouTube to watch, and I'm sure some of them will join you and answer any of the questions that you might be asking right now.